Welcome to Red Wave Novel. Make sure to like and subscribe for more updates.
Members, but only a few had come. He would wait for them. He would welcome his comrades back in his position as guildmaster. A relic of the past, huh? Mamanga sank into thought. Although the guild now was just an empty shell, he had enjoyed his time with it. He turned his eyes to look at the huge flags hanging from the ceiling. There were 41 of them in total, the same number as there were guild members. Each of them displayed the personal symbol of each guild member. Mamanga extended a bony finger and pointed to one of them. Then he turned his attention to a nearby flag. That flag represented one of the strongest players in Overlord, no, in all of Yggdrasil. He was the one who had started the guild, and the one who had gathered the original 9. Touch me. The symbol on the next flag he pointed to belonged to the oldest member of Overlord, who was a lecturer in a university in real life. Shijuten Suzaku. His finger moved faster than before as he shifted to the flag which belonged to one of the 3 female members of Overlord. Ankoro Machimachi. Mamanga fluently recited the names of the various symbols: owners Hiro, Parentino, Biki Bikujigama, Tabula Smeridino, warrior take Mikazuchi, variable talisman, Jinjiro. It did not take long for him to name all 40 of his former comrades. Their names were still branded deeply in Mamanga's brain. He sprawled tiredly on the throne. Yeah, it really was fun. Even though the game did not have any subscription fees, Mamanga had still spent a third of his monthly salary on it. It was not because his salary was high, but because he had no other hobbies, so he funneled all his income into Yggdrasil. There was a cash gacha in the game where players could pay for a chance to win a prize. Mamanga spent nearly his entire bonus on it and barely managed to get a rare item out of the experience. When he heard that one of his guild members, Yameko, had won that item for the cost of a lunch, Mamanga had been so envious that he wanted to roll around on the ground. TL note: gachas are slang for game-based lotteries or lucky draws. They're named after gachapons, which are coin-operated vending machines which randomly dispense a prize. Because almost all of Overlord's members were productive members of society, most of them were willing to spend money on this hobby, and among them Mamanga was one of the bigger spenders. He was probably one of the top few on the server. That was how dedicated he was. Adventuring was fun, but his greatest joy was found in playing with his friends. To Mamanga, whose parents had passed away and who had no friends in real life, the guild Overlord was a shining memory of the good times he had had with his friends. And now, this guild would disappear. His heart was filled with regret and reluctance. Mamanga gripped the staff of Overlord tightly. He was just an ordinary salaryman and he lacked the financial power or connections to change that fact. He was just another player who could only watch the closing time as it approached. The time on his watch read 23:57. The server would shut down at 00. There was little time left. The virtual world would end, and he would have to go back to reality the next day. That was only natural. Nobody could live in a virtual world, which was why everyone had left, one by one. Mamanga sighed. He had to wake up at 4 tomorrow. He had to sleep the moment the servers shut down in order not to affect the next day's work. 23:59, 35, 36, 37. Mamanga set his watch to count out the seconds. 23:59, 48, 49, 50. Mamanga closed his eyes. 23:59, 58, 59. The countdown finished. He waited for the curtains to fall on his fantasy world. He waited for the automatic logout. 000 2 3 8 Mamanga opened his eyes. He had not returned to his familiar room. This was still the throne room in Yggdrasil. What's going on? The time was right. He should have been forcibly logged out by the server shutdown. 00:38. It was definitely past midnight. The clock could not have gone wrong because of a system error. Confused, Mamanga looked around him, searching for any clues in the vicinity. Could it be they delayed the server shutdown? Or had they extended playtime as a form of compensation? Although numerous reasons appeared in his mind, they were all far from the truth. However, the most likely reason was that an irresistible force had cropped up and extended the server shutdown time. If that was the case, the GMS would have made an announcement. Mamanga hurriedly worked to reopen the message panel he had closed, and then he stopped halfway. There was no command console. What on earth happened? Mamanga was filled with panic, frustration, and suspicion, but he was also surprised by how calm he was considering the circumstances. He decided to call on other means. Force connections that did not require a console, the chat function, a GM call, a forced logout. None of them responded. It was as though they had been deleted from the system. What the hell is going on? Momonga's angry voice echoes through the throne room, then vanished. Today was the last day of Yggdrasil, yet all these things were happening on a day that should have marked an end to the game. Was this some kind of prank they were pulling on the players? Momonga was quite unhappy that he could not meet the end of the game in style, and the words he muttered clearly illustrated the anger inside him. There should not have been any reply to his hostile suspicion. However, what's wrong, Momonga-sama? It was the first time he had heard that beautiful woman's voice. Momonga was startled, but he still kept searching for the source of the voice. When he found the one who had spoken the words just now, he was speechless. The person who had answered him was the NPC raising her head, albedo. Part 3. Karn Village. It was located on the border of the kingdom at the Empire, near the southern tip of the Isla mountain range, just outside a patch of woodland named the Great Forest of Tob. For a frontier village of the Riesti's kingdom, its population was unexceptional, 120 souls, distributed among 25 families. The village made its living from the resources of the forest and agriculture. Apart from doctors and herbalists who came to collect herbs, the only visitors to the village were the yearly tax collectors. Time seemed to stand still for the few residents of this village. Village life was very busy even in the early hours of the morning. Villages did not possess the magical illumination of continual light which could be found in cities, so the villagers would rise with the sun and work hard all day until the sun went down. The first thing Henri Emot did after getting up extra early in the morning was to carry water from the nearby well. Hauling water was a woman's job, and once she finished filling the big water tank in the house, that chore was complete. By this time, her mother would have prepared breakfast for their family of 4. Breakfast was barley or wheat porridge, as well as cooked vegetables. Sometimes, they would have dried fruit as well. After breakfast, she would tend the fields with her parents. Her 10-year-old sister would go into the forest to gather firewood or help with the field work. When the bell in the middle of the village square, rang to signal noon, everyone would break for lunch. Lunch would be black bread baked several days before, as well as soup with some shredded meat jerky sprinkled in. Field work would resume after lunch, and when the sun set they would return home for dinner. For dinner, they would have the same black bread that they had for lunch, as well as bean soup. If the village hunters managed to bag any prey, they might be able to get some meat to go with their dinner. After dinner, the family would gather around the light of the hearth fire to take care of household chores, such as mending worn or damaged clothes. They would go to sleep around 8. The girl Henri Emot was born 16 years ago and had become a part of the village since then. She had lived these days all her life. In her heart, she wondered, how much longer will these unchanging days continue? Today was no different from any other. After waking up, Henri went to the well to carry water. After filling her buckets at the well, she would need 3 trips to fill the house's water tank. Yosh. Henri rolled up her sleeves, exposing her untanned skin, which was pale and stood out. Long years of farm life ensured that although her arms looked slender and frail, they were actually very strong, with just a hint of muscle on them. The filled buckets were very heavy, but Henri hoisted them up like she always did. If the buckets were bigger, I could make fewer trips. Wouldn't that make things easier? Then again, if the buckets were bigger, I probably wouldn't be able to lift them. As Henri thought about that issue on her way back home, she heard a sound and turned to look at it. There was tension in the air over there, and the seeds of fear began sprouting in her heart. Her ears seemed to pick up something like wood being broken, and after that, a scream. It sounded like a strangled bird, but there was no way it could be a bird's call. A chill ran down Henri's spine. Unbelievable. There must be some kind of mistake. It couldn't be a human's voice. She tried to erase her unease with these thoughts, and then they vanished. She had to run to the source of the scream, because it was coming from the direction of her home. Henri cast aside the water buckets. She could not run while carrying that heavy burden. Although she nearly tripped over her long skirt, she managed to keep her balance by some stroke of luck. The sound rang through the air once more. Henri's heart lurched in her chest. There was no mistake about it. It was a human scream. She ran and ran and ran. Henri could not recall going faster than this in her life. She was running so fast that her legs were about to tangle each other up. The neighs of horses, the screams of people, and shouts. These sounds were becoming clearer and clearer. In the distance, Henri could see an unfamiliar man in armor swinging his sword at a villager. The villager collapsed to the ground with a howl of pain, like a puppet whose strings had been cut, and a swift thrust from the sword dealt him a fatal blow. Morga-san! There were no strangers in a small village like this. Everyone was as close as kin. As such, Henri knew exactly who had been killed before her eyes. Mr. Morgo was a loud but pleasant man. He had done nothing wrong and did not deserve to die like this. Henri wanted to stop, but in the end she gritted her teeth and ran on. The distance that felt fairly close while carrying water now felt like an endless stretch. As the sounds of shouts and cursing filtered into her ears, she finally saw her home before her. Henri opened the door as she shouted for her family. She found 3 familiar faces with unfamiliar looks of fear. They were motionless. However, when Henri opened the door and entered, their faces softened, the fear replaced by relief. "Henri, are you all right?" Her father hugged her in his strong arms, which were brawny and tough from field work. "Ah, Henri." Her mother's gentle arms embraced her. "Good, Henri's back, then we'd better flee too." The Emot family was in grave danger. They had stayed at home because they were worried about leaving Henri behind, and so they had missed the best chance to escape. The threat to their lives would be catching up with them any moment now. As she thought about that fear, it became a reality. Just as the family was about to run, a human figure appeared in the house's doorway. The man, silhouetted by sunlight, glittered. He was a fully armored knight whose breastplate bore the insignia of the Baharuth Empire. He held a long sword in his hand. The Baharuth Empire was a neighbor of the Re-Estize kingdom, and the two of them had waged frequent wars against each other. Until recently, the flames of war were mostly limited to the region around the fortress city of Irantel and had not spread to this village. However, the quiet life they had enjoyed would end here. Henri could feel the man's cold eyes on her from between the vision slits of his helmet, as though he were counting up how many people were in Henri's family. It frightened her. The knight clenched the gauntlet holding his sword, and a creaking sound came from where metal rubbed against metal. And then, just as he was about to enter the house, "You, no." Her father lunged at the man, tackling him out of the doorway and out of the house with his momentum. "Hurry up and run!" "Damn!" Blood streamed from a small cut on her father's face. He must have gotten hurt while bull rushing the knight. Henri's father was rolling around as he grappled with the knight on the ground. The knight grabbed the hand of Henri's father, which was holding a knife, while he in turn kept the knight from drawing his short sword. The sight of blood on the body of one of her family members made Henri's mind go white. She wavered over whether to help her father or run away. "Henri, Nemo!" Her mother's shouts returned Henri to her senses, and as she looked at her mother, she saw the older woman shaking her head, with a heart-breaking expression on her face. Henri grabbed her little sister's hand and ran after her mother with big strides. Guilt and hesitation clawed at her heart, but in the end, she knew they had to flee into the great forest of Tom. The neighing of horses, angry shouts, the clash of steel, and the stench of burning flesh. All these assaulted Henri's ears and nose from the direction of the village. Where had it come from? Henri ran with all her might as she tried to make sense of matters. When fleeing to an open space, she had to make her body as small as possible, or hide in the corners of houses. The violent beating of her heart chipped away at the fear that threatened to freeze her body solid. In addition, the small hand she held in hers spurred her on. Her sister. Her mother, who was running ahead of her, suddenly froze and immediately doubled back, her hands frantically gesturing at them to run somewhere else. As Henri realized why her mother would do that, she bit her lip and forced back her tears. She clenched her little sister's hand and ran, trying desperately to get away from there, because she did not want to see what would happen next. Hard 4. Is something wrong, Momonga-sama? Albedo kept asking him questions. Momonga did not know how to respond. As it was, there were far too many things he did not understand, so his thought processes short-circuited. "Forgive me." Momonga could only stare dumbly at Albedo, who was standing by his side. "Are you all right?" Albedo's beautiful face drew close to Momonga's as she studied him. A faint fragrance entered his nostrils. The scent seemed to restore Momonga's ability to think, and his mind, which had been hitherto out of commission, slowly returned to normal. "No, nothing is wrong, no, nothing." Momonga was not the sort of person who made a habit of speaking politely to dolls. However, hearing Albedo's questions instinctively made him want to respond with deference. Her movements, her speech patterns, her whole being radiated an undeniable humanity. Momonga still had the feeling that something was terribly wrong about Albedo and himself, but he had no way of understanding exactly what the problem was. All he could do in this ignorant state was to suppress his fear, shock, and other unnecessary emotions. However, Momonga was a common person and could not do that. Just as Momonga was about to cry out, the words of one of his guild members came to mind. "Panic is the seed of defeat. so you must maintain your calm and think logically. Remain calm, look beyond your surroundings, and don't waste your effort on unnecessary details, Momonga-san. As he recalled these words, Momonga slowly regained his composure. Momonga silently thanked Punitomo, the huge liang of Ain't Thule gown. Is something the matter? She was close to him now. Albedo was so close he could feel her gentle breaths. Her lovely face dimpled in an adorable way as she asked her question. Momonga, who had calmed himself after much effort, was in danger of being driven into panic again from her nearby face. The GM call function does not seem to be working. Entranced by Albedo's limpid eyes, Momonga could not help but question the NPC. In Momonga's past life, he had not received romantic attention from the opposite sex, let alone those of a sexual nature. Although he knew that she was just an NPC, he could not help but be moved by her realistic expressions and movements. However, as his passions stirred within his heart, they were quenched like they had been earlier, and he returned to normal. Momonga felt uneasy at the lack of strong emotions within himself, and he wondered if it was related to the words of his comrade from just now. But was that really the case? Momonga shook his head. Now was not the time to ponder these things. Please forgive my inability to answer the Supreme One's questions about this GM call. I apologize for not meeting your expectations. Nothing would please me more than a chance to make up for my prior mistake. Please command me as you see fit. The two of them were conversing. There was no doubt about that. Learning this fact shocked Momonga so greatly that he could not speak. Impossible. This should have been impossible. The closest thing NPCs could come to conversations was with macroed responses to being addressed in a certain way. There was audio data for roars and cheering for players to download, but actually allowing an NPC to engage in conversation was an impossible task. Even Sebas from just now could only accept simple orders. Why had such an impossible event occurred? Was this phenomenon limited to Albedo? Momonga dismissed Albedo with a wave of his hand, and disappointment flashed across her face as she retreated. Momonga turned his eyes from her body to the butler and the 6 maids, whose heads were still lowered. Sebas, maids. Yeah. Their voices chorused out as one, and then the butler and maids raised their heads. Approach the throne. Understood. They responded as one, and then rose to their feet. After that, they proudly strode to the front of the throne before dropping to one knee and lowering their heads again. Momonga had learned 2 things from this. The first was that he did not need to specially enter commands on a keyboard. The NPCs would understand his intentions and execute his orders. The second was that Albedo was not the only one who could speak. At the very least, all of the NPCs in this room were exhibiting anomalous behavior. As Momonga thought about this, he suddenly felt that there was something very wrong about himself and Albedo. In order to discover exactly what that something was, he fixed Albedo with a piercing gaze. Is something wrong? Have I made a mistake? As he finally realized what the problem was, he did not shout, nor did he keep silent, but he simply sighed imperceptibly. That unexpected breadth of facial expressions, the reason why her mouth could move and why she could speak. Possible. Momonga hurriedly placed a hand on his mandible and spoke. His mouth was moving. This should have been impossible, going by what he knew about MMORPGs. A character's mouth would not move with their words. The basic premise was that external appearances were fixed. Because of that, facial expressions were impossible to design. In addition, Momonga's face was a skull without a tongue or a throat. He looked down to his hands, and they were the same fleshless pair that he was used to. He could also see that he had no lungs or, indeed, any other internal organs. But then, how was he speaking? Impossible. Momonga could feel the certainty he had in the world evaporating away, replaced by an ever-growing uneasiness. He suppressed his desire to shout out and, like he expected, his surging emotions were suddenly quashed. Momonga slapped forcefully at the throne, but as he expected, no damage values appeared. What should I do? Is there anything I can do? He knew nothing about what was going on. Nobody would help him even if he got angry. Then, his first priority should be looking for clues. Sebas. He could see an earnest, sincere expression on Sebas's face. He looked like a real person. It should be fine to give him orders, right? Although he had no idea what would happen, he could assume all the NPCs in the tomb were loyal to him, right? For all he knew, the people in front of him might not be the NPCs that everyone had made together. Numerous questions rose up in his mind, floating on a sea of uneasiness, but Momonga forced aside all these emotions. In the end, the only choice he had for reconnaissance was Sebas. He glanced briefly to Albedo, but then Momonga steeled himself and decided to order Sebas out. The mental image of a department chief giving orders to his subordinates appeared in his mind. Momonga took on a superior, commanding attitude and spoke. Exit the tomb and investigate the surrounding region. If you encounter intelligent creatures, interact peacefully with them and invite them to the tomb. Attempt to accommodate the other party as much as possible during negotiations. Do not stray more than 1 kilometer from the tomb and avoid unnecessary combat. Understood, Momonga-sama. I will do so immediately. In Yggdrasil, NPCs made to protect a guild base could not leave it under any circumstances. However, it would seem this ironclad restriction had been overturned. No, he could only be certain of that once Seba's returned. Select one of the Pleiades to accompany you. If battle begins, retreat immediately and tell me everything you have learned. That was simply the first step. Momonga let go of the staff of Ain's Ul gown. The staff did not fall onto the ground, but floated in the air as though someone were still holding it. This was in complete defiance of physics, but it was a common sight in the game. There were quite a few items in Yggdrasil which would continue floating in the air when left unattended. The aura of tormented spirits seemed to cling to Momonga's hand as he let the staff go, but Momonga paid it no heed. He was long since used to that sight or not. Thinking that the macro command would have already been built in, Momonga snapped his fingers and deactivated the aura. Momonga folded his arms. The next step would be, I should contact the game company. The game company would know the most about Momonga's present situation. The problem was actually contacting them. Normally, simply using the shout command or a GM call would put him in touch with a GM instantly, but if these methods did not work either. Message. This was a spell used to communicate in the game. Normally, its use was restricted to certain places and conditions, but perhaps he might be able to make good use of the spell in this current situation. The problem was that this spell was originally designed to communicate with other players, so it might not be able to reach a GM. And in this extraordinary situation, there was no guarantee that the spell would work either. However, he had to give it a try. Momonga was a level 100 spellcaster. If he could not cast spells, his mobility, his ability to gather information, and of course his fighting power would plummet drastically. In these unknown circumstances, he had to verify that he could use magic, and quickly. Now where can I go to test my magic? As Momonga thought about that question, he looked slowly around the throne room and then shook his head. Although this was an emergency situation, he had no desire to conduct magical experiments in the silent, nearly sacrosanct throne room. He contemplated suitable locations for magical testing, and then a promising place came to mind. There was one more thing he wanted to confirm, in addition to his own abilities. He wanted to be certain of his authority. He had to know whether his power and privileges as the guildmaster of Ain's Ul gown still existed. Until now, all the NPCs he had met were loyal to him. However, in the great underground tomb of Nazarick, there were several NPCs with levels equal to his own. He had to make sure they were still loyal. However, Momonga glanced at the kneeling Sebas and the maids, and then at Albedo beside him. Albedo was smiling. It was a beautiful smile, but it seemed to be concealing something else behind it. As he wondered what that something else might be, unease crept through Momonga. The NPCs were loyal to him, but would they stay that way? If this were in the real world, subordinates would no longer be loyal to superiors who constantly screwed up. Would the NPCs be that way as well? Or was it that once they were programmed to be loyal, they would stay that way forever? If their loyalty to him wavered, how should he regain it? Rewards? There was vast wealth in the treasury. Although it pained him to expend the treasures left behind by his former comrades, they would probably understand if it was for the sake of Ain's Ul gown. The question would then be how large of a reward he should give. In addition, was he superior to others by virtue of being higher ranked? But what criteria could he use to quantify his superiority? He was not clear about that yet. He had the feeling that as long as he kept this dungeon going, he would eventually come to understand these things. Or did that mean a power? He opened his left hand and gripped the staff of Ain's Ul gown that sailed into his grasp. Overwhelming power? The 7 gems set into the staff gleamed brightly, as though imploring their master to use their colossal might. Forget it, I'll take my time to think about that later. Momonga released the staff he held, and the wavering staff fell to the ground as though it were angry at him. In any case, as long as he acted the part of the leader, they would probably not raise their hands against him right away. Be it among animals or humans, enemies would probably not attack if their intended prey did not reveal any weaknesses. Momonga declared in a powerful voice. Pleiades, other than the maids selected to accompany Sebas, the rest of you will head to the 9th floor and repel any invaders from the 8th floor. Understood, Mamanga-sama. The maids behind Sebas acknowledged his orders respectfully. Begin immediately. Understood, my master. Once more the chorus of voices rang out. Sebas and the maids bowed once more to their lord who sat upon the throne, then stood and left simultaneously. The giant's doors opened, and then closed again. Sebas and the maids vanished beyond the doors. It was good that they had not replied with a no, or something similar. A great weight seemed to lift off Mamanga's chest, and at the same time he looked at the person who had stayed by his side. That person was Albedo, who had stood by, awaiting orders. She smiled, and asked him then, Mamanga-sama, what will you have me do next? Ah, I got it. Mamanga rose from the throne to retrieve his staff, and as he did that, he spoke. Come to me. Yes. The smiling Albedo drew closer. Although Mamanga was wary of the black wand and orb she had been carrying, that caution passed in an instant and he decided to temporarily ignore its existence. Just as Mamanga finished thinking that, Albedo was close enough that he could embrace her if he wanted. She smells nice. Wait, what am I thinking? Mamanga cast out the thoughts which had rose up inside him again. Now was not the time for fooling around. He reached out his hand to touch Albedo's. M.O. H.M. A pained expression flickered across Albedo's face. Mamanga drew his hand away, like he had received an electric shock. What's this? Did I make her feel uncomfortable? Several bad memories ran through his mind, like being hit by loose change that fell from the sky, but in the end Mamanga found his answer. Ah! Overlords required levels in the Elder Lei racial class, and among the abilities Elder Liches possessed was the ability to inflict negative energy damage on anything they touched. Was that the reason? Although, even if it really was the reason, he still had some questions asked. In Yggdrasil, the monsters and NPCs that appeared in the great underground tomb of Nazarick would be recognized as belonging to the Aints Woolgown faction. Since every member of the guild was also flagged as belonging to Aints Woolgown, there should be no problems even if they attacked each other. Could it be that she no longer belongs to our guild? Or has friendly fire been enabled? The latter possibility was more likely. With that conclusion in mind, Mamanga apologized to Albedo. Forgive me, I forgot to deactivate my negative energy touch skill. Please pay it no heed, Mamanga-sama. That damage hardly counted as damage, and as long as it is you, Mamanga-sama, I would gladly endure any kind of kaya. Is that so? No, I must still apologize. Mamanga was caught off guard by Albedo's adorable yelp and the way she shyly covered her face, and his reply ended up being less dignified than he had hoped for. So it was due to the negative energy touch after all. Mamanga turned his eyes from Albedo, who was going on and on about how this was nothing compared to the pain of losing her virginity, and began thinking about how to temporarily deactivate the always-on skill, and then he suddenly knew how to do it. To Mamanga, who wielded the power of an overlord, it was as simple and natural as breathing. He could not help but laugh at the strange situation he found himself in. After all the shocks and surprises he had received so far, this was hardly worth panicking about. It was frightening how well he had adapted to his condition. I'm going to touch you. After deactivating the skill, he touched Albedo's hand. Thoughts like her hand so slim, her skin so white, and so on raced through his head, but he cast aside these male desires and focused on one thing, the pulse at her wrist. It was there. It was a steady rhythm, lub-a-dub, lub-a-dub. She was a living being, so it was only natural. Yes, she was alive. Mamanga released her hand and looked at his own arms. All he saw was an expanse of polished white bone, bereft of skin or flesh. Because he had no blood vessels, he could not feel a heartbeat. Indeed, an overlord was an undead creature, a being that had transcended mortality itself, so obviously it would not have a heartbeat. He shifted his gaze to Albedo. Mamanga saw himself reflected within Albedo's moist golden eyes. Her cheeks were pink, probably because her body was rapidly heating up. The changes in her body surprised him. What's this? Is she not an NPC? Is she not pure electronic data? Why does she feel like a real person? What kind of AI could do this? More importantly, why is it that Yggdrasil feels like the real world? Impossible. Mamanga shook his head in denial. There was no way such a fantastic scenario could have occurred. But once the idea took root, it was not easy to eradicate. Mamanga was not sure how to proceed given the changes in Albedo. The next step, yes, the final step. If he could confirm that, then all of his predictions would be vindicated. Was this real life, or was this just fantasy? He had to do this. If she attacked him with that weapon of hers, it could not be helped. Albedo, may I touch your breasts? Eh? The air between them seemed to freeze. Albedo's eyes went wide. A wave of depression washed over Momonga as he considered his words. I have to do this. What the hell was he thinking, saying that to a woman? He wanted to scream despicable at the top of his voice. Indeed, using one's superior position to commit sexual harassment was the most despicable thing imaginable. But he had no choice. Indeed, he had to do this. As Momonga convinced himself with all his strength, his composure gradually returned to him. Resuming the air of a proper ruler, he continued forcefully. That should be fine, right? It was not fine at all. In contrast to Momonga's nervous request, Albedo seemed to be overflowing with joy. She gave him a glittering smile. But of course, Momonga-sama, please help yourself. Albedo straightened herself up, presenting her ample twin peaks for Momonga's inspection. If he still had saliva, he would have swallowed several times by now. Her breasts swelled up through her dress, and now he was going to touch them. On the other side of his abnormal tension and nervousness, a quiet, calm part of Momonga's brain was observing his own actions. He noted how foolish he was and wondered why he had thought of this and why he was still going to follow through anyway. He sneaked a peek at Albedo and found that her eyes were shining, jiggling her bosom as though to say, "Hurry up and touch me." Not knowing whether it was because of excitement or embarrassment, Momonga steadied his hands with sheer force of will, steeled his resolve, and reached out. The first thing Momonga felt was something hard under the dress, followed by a soft, yielding sensation. Feel ha! As Albedo moaned wetly, Momonga completed yet another experiment. If his brain was normal, there were two possible explanations for his present situation. The first was that this was a new DMMORPG. That was to say, the moment Yggdrasil had shut down, a new game, Yggdrasil Roman 2, had immediately taken its place. However, in light of this experiment, the probability of that being the case was vanishingly small. This was because R18 actions were strictly forbidden in these games. Who knew, perhaps even R15 actions might be banned as well. Violators would be publicly listed on the game's official website, and their accounts would be deleted, or worse. Once the records of these R18 actions were publicly released, they might be punished for damaging moral culture and thus violating the Social Order Maintenance Act. As such, most people would consider these acts off-limits. If they were still in a game world, the company should have made it impossible for players to do such things. If the GMS and the game companies were watching, they would have prevented Momonga from performing lewd actions. However, there was no sign of any resistance or opposition. In addition, one of the fundamental rulings which pertained to DMMORPGs was that forcing a player to participate in the game without permission could be treated as a form of cyber kidnapping. As such, forcing a player to test out a game in this manner was a prosecutable offense, especially if there was no way to force quit the game. It would not be unexpected for a company to receive fines or jail time for such things. If a situation arose where a player was not able to log out of the game, up to a week's worth of game activity could be stored in a legally inundated record, which would make it easy to prosecute the company for their violations of the law. Therefore, if Momonga did not report to work for a week, someone would have found it strange and come to his house to check on him. Then all the police would need to do was to access the records with a specialized console and the problem would be solved. Which company would risk arrest or worse to commit a corporate crime like this? Of course, they could try to muddy the waters by saying this was a closed beta test for Yggdrasil Roman 2, or there were third-party programs used here. But in truth, such a risky matter would have no benefits at all for the game company. That being the case, the only answer for his present circumstances would be that a third party was doing something here and it had nothing to do with the game company. If that was the case, he would need to throw out all his previous theories and think in other directions, otherwise he would never find the answer. The problem was that he had no idea where to start, and there was another possibility. The possibility that the virtual world had become reality. Impossible. Momonga promptly rejected that idea. How could such an illogical, foolish thing happen? But on the flip side, the more he thought about it, the more strongly he felt it was the right answer. And then, Momonga remembered Albedo's scent. In accordance to the software legislation for virtual reality games, such games were not allowed to provide sensory data for smell and taste. Although Yggdrasil had food and drink items, consuming them was little more than changing a value in the game system. In addition, the sense of touch was heavily limited in order to prevent confusion with the real world. These limitations meant that VR systems were not very useful for the sex industry. However, none of these limitations were in effect now. Realizing these facts shocked Momonga. Countless questions like, what about tomorrow's work? What'll happen if this keeps up? Flashed through his mind, but then he cast them all to the back of his mind. If this virtual world is just a simulation of the real world, then the quantity of data involved must be unimaginable. Momonga swallowed with a non-existent throat. Though his mind could not comprehend this situation, his heart could. His hands finally left Albedo's ample bosom. He realized that he had been groping her for a long time, but Momonga justified it to himself by saying that he had no choice but to grope her for that long, and it was definitely not because squeezing her supple flesh felt so good that he reluctantly let go of her or something. Sorry, Albedo. P.O.A. A sensual moan came from the red-faced Albedo, and he could practically feel her body heat raising the surrounding temperature. After that, she shyly asked Momonga, "Will I have my first time here?" Momonga was caught off guard by her question, and before he could think clearly, he replied, "Eh?" His mind was suddenly frozen and was unable to parse her question. First time? What's that? What's this all about? And why does she look so shy? May I ask how you wish to dispose of my clothes? What? Would it be better if I disrobed myself? Or would you like to unwrap me, Momonga-sama? Or if we did it while I was wearing the dress, afterwards it would get dirty. No, if you want me to wear this dress, I have no objections, Momonga-sama. His brain finally managed to make sense of Albedo's words, although whether there really was a brain under that skull remained to be seen. As Momonga realized why Albedo had this reaction, an immense struggle took place within himself before he finally said, "Enough, that's all for now, Albedo." "Eh, I understand. Now is not the time for no, there's no time for that sort of thing. My apologies. I allowed myself to be ruled by my desires despite the urgency of the situation." With a swift movement, Albedo made to genuflect an apology, but Momonga stopped her. "No, all this is my fault. I forgive you, Albedo. That aside, I have an order. Please give me any command you desire. Tell the guardians of each floor, with the exception of the 4th and the 8th floors, to meet at the Coliseum on the 6th floor in an hour's time. I will contact Aura and Mare myself, so there is no need to inform them." Understood. Allow me to repeat the order aside from Aura and Mare of the 6th floor. I am to inform all the floor guardians to meet 1 hour later at the Coliseum. Correct? Yo. Yes. Albedo swiftly departed the throne room. As he watched the retreating Albedo, Momonga let himself sigh in a way that suggested he was thoroughly exhausted. Once she left the throne room, Momonga groaned painfully. "Oh, what have I done? It was supposed to be a silly joke. If I'd known, I wouldn't have done it. I've soiled the NPC tabulous Maridina-san created." When he thought about it, there was only one reason why Albedo would react like she had. It must have been when he was editing her backstory and changed that line to "she is in love with Momonga." That must have been why she acted that way. Ah shit! Momonga muttered to himself, thinking about how Tabulous Maridina had painstakingly created his masterpiece Albedo out of whole cloth, and then someone else had splashed paint all over his work at will, and now she had become like this. The knowledge that he had ruined someone else's hard work made him feel miserable. However, the frowning Momonga, although it could not be seen because he was a skeleton, eventually rose from the throne. Momonga told himself that he had to leave this at the back of his mind. After the important things were taken care of, he could agonize over it later.